Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for this. We have to say webinar, don't we, because we're online, but it's a seminar. I think the boundaries now have completely dissolved between what's digital and what's not. And what matters actually is the subject that we're going to talk about. Although actually it occurs to me before I even do that, I should introduce myself, given that I'm the first person you'll be seeing and hearing from in this. I am Raphael Baer. I am a political columnist for The Guardian. Hopefully you won't be hearing that much from me because we have such an eminent panel of people who are going to give us much more insight on our topic. The culture wars, what can we learn from the US? Although I suspect a lot of people will be thinking, how can we learn not to be like the US in that respect? That may be unfair. The culture wars, again, I look forward to hearing from our panelists on this, but certainly in the UK context, culture wars, it's one of those irregular verbs, isn't it? It's sort of I stand up for my values, you are being needlessly partisan, he, she, it wages a culture war. It's always something that other people are doing to me or to each other, and never something that I am doing to someone else. And there has to be a problem there because someone's doing it, because it does seem to be all around us. It is traditional at these things to give sort of lavish introductions to the guest speakers, but you know who they are. Well, you probably know who they are, and also I don't want to. If I spent too long talking about them, I should say who they are first of all, which is Professor Bobby Duffy, Professor of Public Policy and Director of Policy of the Policy Institute here at King's. Here being very much a metaphor there. Professor Liliana Mason, Professor of Government and Politics at Johns Hopkins, and Professor Morris Fiorina, the Wendt Family Professor, I hope I pronounced that correctly, of Political Science and a Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution. Now, but I won't give you any more detail because I don't want to disrespect them by not giving their credentials. I want to show them more respect by just allowing them to speak, on which note I will now stop speaking. The way it will work, will shortly stop speaking. Bobby Duffy is going to first give us an overview of the situation in the UK. Lily, she's given me permission to call her Lily, will then give us some reflections on the US situation, which will illuminate what Bobby's just said. And then Mo, he has also given me permission to call him Mo, will give us some further reflections on the US context. And by that stage, there will be so much pent up energy of questions that we will go straight into the Q&A. Although I should reserve the right to abuse my position in the chair and throw in some questions of my own if they arise, and I apologize in advance for doing that. That's definitely enough from me. So over to you, Bobby.
Brilliant. Thank you, Raphael. And I have to say, I'm hugely excited about this one and to hear from Lily and Mo. So I'm just going to spend my section just giving a little bit of context from the report that we did on culture wars in the UK, but really looking forward to the discussion. And I'm going to try and make 5 points in the time I have available. The first is that there really has been an explosion of UK media coverage of culture wars in recent years, as we saw in our report. Part of that was a media content analysis done by colleagues here at King's that looked at newspaper articles all the way back to 1993 up to 2020 and split them by articles referencing culture wars in the UK and articles referencing culture wars elsewhere, which was largely the US. And you can kind of see that in this purple line here. That's just a pure count. And you can see around presidential elections, we get a little peak in discussions of culture wars and then a big surge around the 2020 election, not surprisingly, given the context there. But that surge is absolutely dwarfed by the light blue line, which is articles referencing culture wars in the UK, in UK newspapers. And this is, incredible. We've gone from just 21 articles talking about culture wars in the UK in 2015 to 534 articles by the time we get to 2020. So we really have just wholesale imported this discussion very quickly. I have to say, that's just the term culture wars. It doesn't cover all the issues or stories around this. We're starting on a new project now looking at the use of the term woke, because that's become a key dividing line in discussions here. And it does raise this interesting question about whether this is top-down, created by the media, activists and politicians, or whether it's more bottom-up, reflecting public concern. And when you see trends like that, you do think there is a top-down element to it, in terms of how the reference, the frame is being set by the media in particular. And this is where I take the dangerous step of quoting one of my fellow panelists in Mo, but I think what Mo says about the US is really interesting. In, I think, your 2010 book, that reports of a culture war are mostly wishful thinking and useful fundraising strategies on the part of culture war guerrillas, abetted by a media driven by the need to make the dull and everyday appear exciting and unprecedented. And I think we've got elements of that, definitely that sense of drama, creative drama in the UK situation. And we can tell that from some of the public perspectives on this. So we did a big survey as part of this study with Ipsos Mori, where 77% of the UK public agree the media often makes our country feel more divided than it really is. Public are aware of that. There's fewer, but still a big chunk of the population, 44% of the UK public agree politicians invent or exaggerate culture wars as a political tactic. So there is a big sense of that among the public. But equally, in the end, only 12% of people agree that culture wars only exist in the media or on social media, but not in real life. So there is a sense of this mix of top-down and elements of bottom-up in terms of concern about culture change. The second of my 5 points I want to make in the time, though, is just to be quite precise in our use of the terms. And this is really useful, really important in a UK context where it's a newer discussion to us. We can learn a lot from US colleagues on this, because a culture war signals much more than disagreement, even fractious disagreement between groups. And you can go back to James Davison Hunter's 1991 book on culture wars, where he talked about this being a sense of conflict between two irreconcilable views of what is fundamentally right and wrong about the world we live in. It's not just disagreement on the issues, it is a completely different opposing worldviews, which have been developed by lots of great academics, including Lily, who helped developing the idea of mega identities, that more and more issues get rolled into these identities. And when mega identities get formed, it's much easier to start to think of the outgroup partisans as quite different from us, because it touches so many different aspects of life or views, which then in turn makes it easier to dehumanize them, to think of them with less generosity, and just become more tribal around these breaks. And then most recently, in terms of more recently, Ezra Klein's book on why we're polarized talks about how that when you activate one of these identities that have been rolled into these mega identities, you often activate them all. And then each time they're activated, they strengthen, which I think is an important point about how it can get quite difficult to get out of this process once you're into it. Culture wars is a process, and it's difficult to reverse once you've started to get that identities right at the center of our political discussion. But the third point I wanted to make is a big but. But the UK public are not paying nearly as much attention as you might think from those trends in the coverage that you've seen. So we asked people completely openly in this survey, what sort of issues do you think of when we say to you culture wars? And if this was a live event, I'd get you to shout out guesses of the different types of issues that people get. And eventually people do get the right answer here, which is none or nothing. That's the top issue that people think of when they're told the term culture wars. Big chunk of the population, 43% of the population, really got nothing in mind when you say culture wars to them. Important to bear that in mind. And then the issues that do come in after that are these types of things: race, religion, immigration, integration in the UK, these kind of big ticket cultural concerns. And then you have to go quite a long way down the list till you get to the ones that are the focus of the media coverage, that our media content analysis showed were the focus of media coverage, which are things like Black Lives Matter, trans or gender identity issues, statues, tearing down statues in the UK. Last night, the proms, this fieldwork was done last year. So it covered that type of thing, COVID, and then right at the bottom, barely measurable, no platforming in universities, just not really associated, despite a lot of focus on that as an issue in the media. So given that, it's not really that surprising that only a third of the public in the UK agree the UK is divided by culture wars. As part of the big culture wars study that we did, we also asked a international survey, 28 countries, a series of questions, including this one of whether you agree or disagree that your country is divided by culture wars. And you can see this incredible spectrum across different countries of different levels of agreement, where Britain is down there in the bottom half with about a third. You've got South Africa, India, and then the United States, much more likely to have people say that they feel divided by culture wars, nearly twice as likely, but an incredible spectrum across different countries. And partly that will be about a recognition of the term, it just being around longer in the US and people having more sense of that. But on more detailed questions about how much tension there is between different groups across these different countries, the UK is behind the US for perceived tension in lots of different perspectives. And there's a lot of data on this slide, but if you just let your eye follow down the light blue bars, you can see that's the US. US, much higher levels of agreement. There's a great deal of a fair amount of tension between different sorts of groups in the US than we see in the UK. And you can see it particularly perhaps on people who support different political parties. Nearly everyone in the US saying that there's a fair amount or a great deal of tension between those, rather less so in the UK, and those with socially liberal, progressive ideas compared to those with more traditional values, and between different ethnicities. There's these bigger gaps and bigger sense of division in the US than the UK. And this reflects a broader point in the UK as part of the analysis that we did of the big survey that we did in the UK. It's very clear that we don't yet have two monolithic blocks, two tribes facing off against each other in the UK. We did this segmentation where, yes, at one end of the spectrum, you do have about a quarter of the population who could be counted as traditionalists in terms of their values. There's an older group, more heavily male, and among their defining features is they're most nostalgic for the country's past, proud of British Empire, but a whole range of other traditional values or attitudes. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got progressives, which are the youngest group, highest education level, most likely to think women's rights, ethnic minority rights, and trans rights have not gone far enough. But that's only half the population. And there are two other important groups. First of all, a disengaged group, 1 in 5 of the population who just don't engage much, don't take much of a stance on culture war issues or politics or Brexit either. And then the largest group is actually this moderate group, a really interesting group, much more nuanced in their views, who support greater rights for women and ethnic minorities on the one hand, but on the other hand, agree political correctness has gone too far. And that's a strong feeling in the UK. We come top of the tables of that sense of you can't say anything these days. When we do these international studies, we have got that strong sense of political correctness gone too far. But on the other hand, they're not looking backwards very much. They're not nostalgic for the past nor proud of the British Empire. They're much more situational in terms of their responses. So I guess one of the key themes of our work on this is that we hear an awful lot from the noisy extremes on this in media and social media. And it's not just traditionalists and progressives. It's not even those 2/4 of the population. It's a slither of those quarters of the population that you hear most from. And there's much more nuance in public opinion than can appear from that type of coverage. Which leads on to my fifth and final group of points, which is there's generational aspect to this that I think is really, really important. I would say that because I've written a book recently on generational differences, but it is, I think, an important aspect of this, that there's phony generational stereotypes of fueling this sense of culture war. And in the book, what I tried to do is unpick the effects that we're mixing up in this. And there's only really 3 types of effects that explain all change in societies over time. And that's period effects where the context changes and we're all affected to some degree, whether that's the information environment or a pandemic or whatever it is. Life cycle effects where we change as we age, and we can see that in all sorts of different ways in attitudes and values and politics. And then cohort effects where generations are different from each other and stay different. And culture wars are often presented as down to a new generation of snowflakes or just social justice warriors coming through and going up against maybe a reactionary baby boomer generation. But there's really no evidence for that there's a particularly unusual gap between young and old right now. The evidence shows that there are clear gaps between young and old in attitudes to race, immigration, gender equality, identity, sexuality. But that's always the case. That's always natural that you have this more progressive or comfort with culture change among younger groups. It's not unusual. Instead, what I think we've got going on is 2 things. That thinking today's young or uniquely wrong or weird is just a constant of history. You can see that in all type of eras. So you go back to Socrates, who really didn't like young people in his day. He said the children now love luxury, have bad manners, show disrespect for their elders. But you go through any era and you see the same sort of feeling. So this is a letter to Town and Country magazine in the UK in 1771, calling young people of their day a race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles, which is just a definition of snowflakes 250 years before we came up with the term. So we've got that effect going on, but alongside, it feels worse now, alongside a period effect. It's mixed with a period effect of more fractious politics, more fractious, divided media and social media, and a political focus on cultural change that makes us think that this is more divided or more new or more generational than it really is. So separating those effects is really important in diagnosing what's going on. And it is important because we are seeing the effects on the age and generation split in our voting patterns. And one of the things that'd be good to discuss maybe is whether this focus on culture change naturally builds in generational splits in our politics and our political our voting intentions by age, because young people are more comfortable with culture change than older people. So if you look at the Conservative Party support all the way back to 1983, by these kind of 5 key generations that are often analysed, you can see it's always been a bit of a gap between young and old, but now we've got the biggest gap that we've measured between young and old. We're over half of the pre-war generation of Conservative Party supporters, down to 10% of Gen Z as Conservative Party supporters. But the real change has come with the Labour Party's support. It's really a new pattern, and it's kind of maybe not recognised quite as much, that up until really recently, there has been no age basis to Labour Party support. All the way back to 1983, it goes up and down over time, but there's no age difference or generational difference until just the last few years, where you've had this explosion of, in particular, younger people being drawn more to it. And this is, again, something that'd be great to get into in discussion. I don't want to talk about this too much now, but splitting politics on age, I think, is a particularly risky dynamic to get going. Very difficult to row back from once you get into it. But I'll leave it there in terms of content. I've just finished with a couple of reflections and questions from my perspective. And I suppose these are the things that are exercising us. What are the consequences for the UK in continuing down this path of this focus on culture change and presenting it as a culture war? Is the US a warning of what may come, even given the hugely different political, social, media, cultural differences between the countries, and disagreement about exactly how polarized the US public is, as opposed to the elites are in the US? Much more nuance in the public than in elites, potentially. And then finally, are we risking a spectrum of negative effects? Everything from just decreased cohesion, connection, affected polarization, where we don't like each other, even if we don't disagree, those types of effects, poorer policy making through excluding viewpoints, inability related to an inability to reach compromise and consensus, whether it will activate related identities of nationalism, populism, or other identities that are not may not be constructive, or whether we may just be encouraging extremisms just at the margins, not among the public as a whole, but just at the margins, and that can still be a negative effect. Or in the end, is it a more direct democratic threat? And that's where it's hard in the UK not to end with a conclusion that worries about the Capitol riots and the extent to which that is something that we are trying to build into our future. But there may be many more. I'm really looking forward to both Lily and Mo's views on these consequences and what we can do to avoid it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I was not necessarily, I don't think I'm young anymore, that young, but I might well be a fribble. And so I'm glad to take on that portion of the identity. It's interesting that the test of what you might say if you thought the term culture wars, if you probably asked a few years ago, I might have thought of things like gun laws and abortion. In other words, I would have gone straight away to the US context, or even what side you're on in the Vietnam War, not which side you were in, on whether that was a good idea. And it's amazing how quickly that has now, there are a whole set of UK, British sort of frames of reference that we can apply that to. So yeah, you mentioned, Bobby, the capital in the sense of the US Republic really teetering. It looked from this side, really wobbling on its foundations. And so, Lily, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, first of all, on what that feels like from where you are, and how far down what Bobby illuminated as quite a frightening path you feel the US has gone. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm gonna set this up. So thank you, Bobby, for that glimpse into the UK. And I really appreciate actually that the idea of asking people what the culture war is, because it is sort of an ephemeral concept. And what is the culture that we're actually fighting over? So I'm going to go back to some earlier research of mine where we talk about polarization in the US, and the question is, what are we talking about when we talk about that? What are we talking about when we say things like polarization or culture war? And so this is from data from the American National Election Studies in 2018, in which people were asked their opinions on immigration, Obama's Affordable Care Act, abortion, same-sex marriage, government spending, and gun control. So these are pretty salient issues. Many would say kind of central to the idea of a culture war. But if you take the average of everyone's position, and then label it so that the most extreme liberal position on every issue scores a 0, and the most extreme conservative position on every issue scores a 1, then what we actually see is that both Republicans and Democrats are actually to the left of center on these issues on average, with Democrats more to the left, but Republicans aren't even above 0.5, which would be on the conservative end. If you look at the percentage of these issues on which Democrats and Republicans are holding the correct position, meaning that Democrats are holding a liberal position and Republicans are holding a conservative position, again, we have less than 50% of both Republicans and Democrats holding sort of consistent positions with their party. So, and this is in 2016. So this is a picture of an electorate that has a lot of room to compromise and can probably get things done and find all kinds of ways to work together, even on really salient issues. But in the same survey with the same people, you ask Democrats and Republicans how they feel about one another, and that's where we see polarization, right? Democrats on a feeling thermometer, where 0 is I feel very coldly towards the group, and 100 is I feel very warmly towards the group. Democrats feel about 27 degrees towards Republicans, which is quite cold, and 75 degrees towards people in their own party. And then for Republicans, we see the exact mirror image. So they feel warmly towards people in their own party, and they very much dislike people in the other party. So that is not a picture of a country that agrees on stuff and can get things done together and wants to cooperate. And that's really a puzzle that has inspired a lot of the research that I've been doing. And so I've had to go into this, into sort of social psychology in order to help answer this puzzle. And what I basically distilled here is that we all have multiple parts of our own identity, right? We identify with various social groups, and the status of those groups affects how we feel about ourselves and our place in the world. And that's important when we have, but especially when we have this idea of multiple group identities. And so if we have all of these different group identities that are unrelated to one another, then if our party loses an election, for example, that hurts our sense of the status of our party, but we still have all these other parts of our own self-esteem that are untouched by that electoral loss. However, if these identities are all wrapped together with our partisan identity, then that partisan loss can start to sort of infect our sense of status in society across multiple parts of who we think we are at our core. And that creates a much more threatening political environment. So just a quick look at sort of what's been happening in the US in terms of these identities. Each of these, this is from 1972, the American National Election Studies again. Each of these lines is for each group, the percentage of, in this line, men who are Republicans minus the percentage of men who are Democrats. So the party divide within each of these social groups. And so in 1972, we see a small gender gap. We see, conservatives are definitely more Republican. liberals are more democratic. There's no difference between church attenders. People who attend church regularly split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. Southerners at this point were still Democrats. White Americans were Republicans. This is white Americans, higher income Americans and white Americans were Republicans. Black Americans and Catholics were Democrats. Protestants, Republican, union members, Democrats. This is like the classic way that we think about the social divide between the parties. And this is an absolutely normal, typical thing to have, social divisions between parties, have, social groups tend towards one party or another. But the problem is that by 2016, these sort of multiple small divisions have very much deepened, and they have focused around, first, this ideological division has become extraordinarily much larger. Religion has become, right, we have church attenders and Catholics and Protestants all leaning towards the Republican Party. And we have a much larger racial gap where whites and blacks are very much divided by partisanship. So this change has, I think, affected the ways that that Americans think about the consequences of partisan electoral loss, because we have all of these other identities kind of lumped into that event. And so from the first book, what I basically tested and found was that I call this social sorting, where people who have this correct alignment of identities with their party or consistent alignment of identities with their party, they tend to be higher in prejudice against people in the other party. They tend to be more active in politics, and they tend to be more emotionally reactive. So when the party is threatened, the party status is threatened, they become much more angry than people with cross-cutting identities, and they become much more excited when the party is successful. So that was where things stood with this first project. But then I had a conversation with Nathan Kalmo at LSU, thinking about, at the time that I was writing that book, he was writing a book about partisanship during the Civil War, during the American Civil War. And so in this conversation, we sort of started to think about, how extreme might these attitudes be, because we're just sort of asking people about, their feeling thermometers, or how they would feel if if their child married someone from the other party. And these are relatively modest questions. And certainly if you ask people during the Civil War questions about people in the other party, they would have much more extreme responses, and we're just not asking them. So we started asking much more extreme questions in 2017. And have been doing so since then, all the way through June of this past year. And ultimately, this is going to be the new book that's coming out in May. This is the set of questions that we've sort of condensed down to is basically into two categories. The first is moral disengagement, which is basically a psychological and emotional precursor to mass violence. When events occur in which multiple people in a group are harmed, the people harming them have to distance themselves morally from the victims in order to still feel like good people, even though they're committing harm. And so that's composed of, first of all, considering people in the other party a serious threat to, in this case, the United States and its people, say they're not just worse for politics, they're downright evil, and then dehumanizing them. They lack the traits to be considered fully human. The second concept is actual advocacy of what we think of as violence. So, is it okay to send threatening messages to leaders? Is it okay to threaten regular people in a way that makes them feel frightened? And then just how much do you feel it's justified to use violence in advancing political goals? And then think about, what if your party lost the next presidential election, then how justified would it be? So we've been looking at these trends for a while. And what we're seeing is, at least for moral disengagement, we see pretty high levels in the US of people agreeing, first of all, that the other party is a threat. Both Democrats and Republicans, we see, between 60 and 80% agreeing that people in the other party are a threat to the United States. This starts actually, Republicans are starting to pull away from Democrats in our sort of more recent 2020 surveys. Considering the out party to be downright evil, again, between 40 and 70% of Republicans and Democrats are agreeing with that statement. Again, with Republicans sort of moving further beyond Democrats in the later surveys. And then dehumanization, thankfully, is lower, is less popular, but between 20 and 30 to 40% of Democrats and Republicans saying that people in the other party don't behave like humans; they should be treated like animals. And again, with Republicans in 2020, sort of pulling away from Democrats to some degree. When it comes to violence, support for violence, what we're seeing is that, again, very low numbers, right? So the vast majority of Americans do not approve of violence to any degree. This is just people who say that violence is a little bit acceptable, and at least a little bit acceptable, or more. So again, we're seeing 10 to 20% of partisans are agreeing that it's okay to threaten regular people in the other party, and 10 to 30% saying it's okay to agree to threaten leaders in the other party. We see a spike here. This is during the first impeachment of Donald Trump. So we do see a reaction from Republicans increasing their approval. And then another spike, obviously, after the events of, in between November 2020 and February 2021, we had Capitol insurrection, we had the election, and we had the second impeachment of Donald Trump. So we see some reactivity to events. In terms of just approving of violence in general, 10 to 20% of Republicans and Democrats, with Democrats tending to be actually slightly higher in approval during the Trump administration, and then they switch over after Biden wins the election. And then again, if we think about, what if you lose the next election? Slightly higher levels of approval. It might be okay if we lose the next election to engage in violence. So one of the things, this is the update to all the way to June. So February is as far as we go in the book, but we collected data in June. So we're actually seeing a continuing increase in approval of violence today. So one of the questions that we had and that we were trying to answer in the book is, first of all, what is driving this? And when we think about culture wars, one of the things that we think about is racial and ethnic conflict. And so in US, in the study of American politics, we have a scale of racial resentment that is commonly used. It basically measures sort of the degree to which people believe that systemic racism has harmed and continues to harm Black Americans. These are items like Irish, Italians, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. So this scale, if we look at how it relates to attitudes of particularly moral disengagement from people in the other party, we find this really interesting partisan asymmetry. And so this, I think, is really the key to what's going on in American politics, what's driving a lot of this really nasty type of politics. So as racial resentment increases, this line is Republicans. So for Republicans who are very high in racial resentment, they are the most morally disengaged from Democrats. And in fact, racial resentment is the most powerful predictor for Republicans of moral disengagement from Democrats. Also, the Republicans who are very low in racial resentment are by far the most tolerant people in the entire survey, right? Because they have this sense of commonality with Democrats, partially because on average, in this same study, Democrats are scoring on a scale of 0 to 1, Democrats are scoring 0.3, while Republicans on average are scoring 0.7. So there is a difference. And for Democrats, we see a more muted, but still significant interaction where the most radical and morally disengaged Democrats are those who are the lowest in racial resentment. So this is an indicator of kind of what's happening behind these attitudes. There is a battle going on about whether the US has made enough racial progress, needs to continue making racial progress, or has gone too far in making racial progress. Another sort of classic culture war idea is sexism. This is the hostile sexism scale. There's many different ways to measure sexism, but this one is, thinking women fail to appreciate what men do for them. They're trying to gain power by getting control over men, interpret innocent remarks or acts as being sexist. And for Republicans, we see, that went the wrong direction. Oops. Okay. For Republicans, we see again the same response, where the Republicans who are higher in sexism are more morally disengaged from Democrats, and that's just like step back for 1 second and think about what this means. It means that Republicans' attitudes towards women are affecting their feelings about the threat that Democrats pose. Right, so it's not a one-to-one match, but there's a strong relationship here. For Democrats, there's not the same relationship at all. There's no relationship between sexism and their feelings about Republicans. But for Republicans, there's a strong relationship. So the main takeaways here from this research, basically what we're seeing is relatively similar levels of these kind of radical attitudes and ideas between Democrats and Republicans. But they're not due to sort of the same attitudes on both sides. They're due to this really intractable conflict about whether the country needs to make more social progress or sort of go back because we've been making too much. And so the partisan divide now is intense because it's between this idea of creating a full multi-ethnic democracy, egalitarian democracy, or kind of going back to the days of white male hegemony when sort of white Christian males in particular, expected to have higher status in society and to be given the respect that they believe that status entails. And currently what's happening is that we've seen this realignment of our parties where the Republican Party is controlled at this point by people who are really pushing forward for white male hegemony. And the Democratic Party is trying to kind of resist that and push for more egalitarian, fully democratic governance in the US. And so that is one of the sort of crucial elements of why these attitudes are so strong and why I think Democrats and Republicans are pulling apart. Okay, I'm gonna stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. Some of that was depressingly familiar with regard to the UK situation, and some of it was quite sort of alien, which is a familiar experience from British people watching American politics. In the interest of efficiency, let's go straight to Professor Morris Fiorina. Mo, you're on, but you might be on mute.
No, can people hear me here?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right, as one of those initial quotations suggested, I'm a bit of a contrarian on this issue. Are we engaged in a culture war in the US? I would characterize it more as a culture skirmish. There are two small groups, two tribes, yes, little ones. There was a nice study done just a few years ago on hidden tribes that concluded that much of the polarization in the US was driven by 6 to 8% on each side of the political spectrum. These were primarily affluent, highly educated, more white and more male than other parts of the population. And everybody else, other than this 15% or so, can be arrayed along the more middle ranges of the scale. Are we involved or in danger of civil war? No. Now, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to focus on just one point, which is I think a lot of the confusion about the culture war consists of it results from a confusion of political elites with the mass public. These are American terms. I've always preferred a term I got from the British literature, the political class, versus whom I call the normal people in the United States. And a political class are the office seekers and officials and donors and activists, etc. And this class of people has sorted and polarized. And the difficulty with a lot of survey work, I think, is that when people are asked to rate Republicans or Democrats, they think of these people whom they see on TV, the blowhards, the extremists, the radicals, etc. And so they're rating people who aren't really typical Republicans or Democrats. And there is research to suggest, to make it clear, you do get much less hostility, partisan suspicion, and so forth. Now, normal people, they continue to be the way they've been for the 60 or 70 years we've been studying them. They're inattentive to politics. They're confused. They're ambivalent. They're pro-choice and pro-life at the same time. These are not criticisms. We live in a representative democracy, and we don't expect people to be able to make detailed policy decisions. They're uninvolved politically, and they're concerned with bread and butter issues for the most part, not culture war issues. And just to bring that home, there's an organization, the Voter Study Group, funded by the Democracy Fund, and I haven't seen the 2020 report yet, but this was after the 2016 campaign with Hillary's deplorables and Trump insulting everybody around the country, they asked people what issues out of 23 are important to you. And the top 5 are what we typically find that voters want to know about their jobs and their health care, terrorism, Medicare. Here's the bottom 5. Absolutely, 23 out of 23, gay rights, gender equality, a little higher than that. Even abortion, which is considered to be such a polarizing issue, typically comes near the bottom in these kinds of questions. So culture war, these are the kinds of issues, the bottom 5 that animate the political class a lot more than they animate regular voters. The public as a whole is not involved. 240 million people were eligible to vote in the United States. About 10% of them watch one of the broadcast news shows each night. 1 or 2% read one of the major national newspapers. Cable TV, we're talking about 1 to 2% audiences of the eligible electorate. Compare that to Sunday Night Football, gets 5 times as many people as read the Sunday New York Times, et cetera. You've all seen this. And of course, this is old media. What about the internet? Well, just 3 or 4 miles down the road from us is Facebook. They did a big study of filter bubbles. I think probably everybody knows here, filter bubbles, ideological silos, et cetera. That the chattering classes are worried that ordinary Americans are locked into filter bubbles where they only get information that is consistent with their pre-existing points of view. Well, this big Facebook study of their Bing toolbar users completely failed to find any evidence of that. They tracked the behavior of people, their online behavior for three months, and they found that only 14% of the sample clicked on 10 or more news articles in that entire period. And they weren't able to characterize them as liberal or conservative because they found that 96% had read 0 or 1 opinion column in 90 days. Twitter is the new thing, of course. Pew did a big study of Twitter 2 years ago. About 1 out of 5 adult Americans have Twitter accounts, and they're not all following politics, of course. There's lots of reasons to be on Twitter other than politics. But 10% of the users, that is 2% of adults, produced 80% of the tweets and retweets on Twitter. The median top 10% tweets 138 times a month, and the median bottom 90% tweets twice a month. There was the Biden administration had to withdraw one of their nominees earlier in the year because of her Twitter history. She had a history of 88,000 tweets and retweets. Twitter was launched in July of 2006. If she tweeted every day, 7 days a week, the arithmetic is she's on tweeting more than 16 tweets every day. This is a person with a problem. And there are a whole lot of people on Twitter who have problems. They used to say, it was Cato used to end all his talks with Carthage must be destroyed. I'm always tempted to end talks with Twitter must be destroyed. I think it's a real pathology in American politics, simply because so many people in the political class are on it and get their picture from politics from Twitter, which is highly unrepresentative. Willie mentioned the marriage studies. One of my colleagues and friends, Chantal Enger, got enormous publicity for pointing out that today about, let's see, you're 20 to 27% here, about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 Americans would be upset if their child married a member of the other party. And this is way up from back in the 1960s, and seems to suggest really the carryover from politics into regular social life. Now, a scholar at Tufts University in the Northeast Boston area was a bit skeptical, and so he commissioned a study of the 6 New England states plus Pennsylvania and New York. I'll explain why in a minute. And he asked the same question and got similar figures for Democrats. 1 in 5 Democrats, or 1 in 5 Republicans would be upset if a child married a Democrat. Even more hostility toward their child marrying Republicans, 32% there. But I'm not familiar with British English soccer or football. But he also asked people, though this is why the 6 states I'm talking about, would you object if your child married a Red Sox fan or a Yankee fan? These are 2 rivals in the American Baseball League. How about a Phillies fan or a Mets fan? These are rivals in the National League. And he found very similar results that people. Now, does this mean that partisanship and sports fandom are similar? No, he said, what's happening here is that this is people are playing games. I've been to Fenway Park when the Yankees are playing, and basically 4 or 5 times a game, the crowd will sort of take up a chant, Yankees suck. And it's all good humored. It's all good natured. People just do this, smile at each other, high five. And it's sort of the game people are playing. Several other young social psychologists also did a takeoff on the marriage study. How would you feel if your son or daughter who married someone who votes for the other party, but who talks about party politics rarely, who talks about politics frequently? And what they found was that people would rather if their son or daughter married someone from the other party who didn't talk about politics than marry someone from their own party who did talk about politics. There are a lot of people in the United States who think that the Russians interfered, possibly even elected Donald Trump in 2016. And that comes from a lot of media commentary to that effect. Well, the one good study on the importance of the Russians concluded it found no effect. And the reason is so easy to see. The Russians paid Facebook throughout the entire campaign 1/1,000,000th of Facebook's monthly ad revenue and a trivial amount of the content. On Twitter, 0.75% of elections-related tweets and retweets and likes and so forth came from Russian bots, about 0.1% of activities of those who interacted. And YouTube, the Russians uploaded 43 hours of content. Americans, bless their hearts, upload 400 hours every minute of every day, mostly cat videos and things like that, of course. There's a 7-nation study I've recently read out of Oxford, includes the UK and the US, and found what has been found throughout basically political communication history. Political partisans basically just don't pay much attention to internet news. Biased information is less important than no information. It's just a classic finding. And the methodology in some of these studies is getting really impressive. This is a combination survey and web browsing study. And basically, in this study, people were trace amounts of activity on the internet concern politics or partisanship. So my view, just summarizing it all up, is that the culture war issues reemerged in the 1960s. We've always had them. We're an immigrant society. Questions of language, religion, moral behavior, so forth, have always animated American politics. They were absent for about sort of a short generation, the medieval period, when the economy dominated everything. Most Americans are basically live and let live. Things are not, you can do what you want, but let me do what I want. And candidates who are out of step with some broad middle range certainly can suffer electorally. But the reason US politics seems so much nastier today is because the parties are sorted, that we do have two clearly distinct parties today, and Liliana refers to this. And previously, many of the conflicts took place within parties, that anybody my age knows that in the 1960s, things were much more difficult. Property damage, loss of life, injuries, and so forth were far more common. The thing is, everything took place at that time within the Democratic Party. Republicans just stood aside and watched the Democrats tear themselves apart between 1966 and 1974. Today, the conflict is between parties, which spills over into policymaking and sort of just the conduct of politics in Washington and our state legislatures. And the bottom line is that the picture of politics comes from reading basically in the American media, and especially in social media, is just very far from an accurate portrait of the American public and how it believes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got lots of questions already, and I want to go straight into them and to try and make sure sort of all the different points are represented. I'm going to direct some of the questions to specific people and also try and bundle some up together. And I actually want to stay with you, Mo, to begin with, because you've just given us that it's probably fair to call it a skeptical view on the extent to which culture war polarization is qualitatively different now to how it has been in the past. Because if I've understood correctly, you're not disputing that political polarization is still very extreme, and you talk about there being games being played. I don't think anyone thinks that the storming of the Capitol was a game, or at least not for some of the people involved. And so one question which is asked by Ben Coates, Chief of Staff of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, asks a very interesting question which is relevant to us in the UK as well, which is about the hegemony of the two parties, a two-party system, and the way that in particular might cause, as you just described, this polarization or the battles that go on within parties. What is it about the structure the party structures of US politics that might be fomenting this process that is then perceived from the outside as a more extreme polarization than culturally, as you say, might be going on, as it were, in the hearts and minds of the ordinary American citizen.
Yes, the point I've made is our partisan polarization is much greater today. It's because of the sorting that's taken place. If you look at the American electorate in the aggregate, it hasn't changed. The difference is a lot of conservatives who used to be Democrats are now Republicans, and a lot of liberals who used to be Republicans are now Democrats. And so when you divide by parties, the polarization is much greater. We call that sorting, just because when you say polarization, people immediately jump to the whole electorate moving from moving to the extremes. And that's not what's occurred. But yeah, it has terribly deleterious effects on our politics and the conduct of our politics and the ability to get anything done. But I just gave a lecture to the freshmen the other day, and to tell the freshmen that Democrats, there used to be Democrats who opposed gun control. There used to be Republicans who were pro-choice. There used to be Democrats who opposed environmental protection. That 25 years ago, you could find that was fairly common. Today, it is not. Today, all these conflicts take place between the two parties. And what's interesting is I know I've read some stuff in Britain about how the British parties have tended to converge over the years. And whereas the American parties have diverged over the years. It's another case of American exceptionalism when you compare it to European party systems. But yeah, the way the party system is structured really sort of affects the conflict structure in the society.
Bobby, can I bounce that over to you, and also throw in another question that's come up? I won't actually name all the questions because that takes up time, and a lot of the questions are duplications. But specifically, also, we haven't really talked much about Brexit, and I think that's obviously not relevant to the US case, but it is relevant to this point about party identities, because obviously Remain Leave became these sort of very significant culture war categories, as distinct from Labour and Conservative. And as you said, we have a multi-party parliamentary democracy different from the US one. So just picking up from what Mo just said there about the sort of institutional rigidity of a two-party system, how does that play into the UK context, and specifically with regard to Brexit? That's a very big question, so take as much of it as you want.
Yeah, that's a great question, though. That's a really important one. And I think, yeah, so the trends in the UK and much in other countries within Europe over previous decades had been much more towards party de-alignment, where your political identity was becoming less important to people. We'd seen these very long trends of a decline in sense of connection to political parties in the UK through the loss of all sorts of structural supports for parties in trade unions and also in religion and all sorts of other aspects in the UK and elsewhere. But then we had Brexit, and the key dynamic of Brexit is not that it created all of this. I think the clear understanding of what happens there is that the Brexit process and that focus on culture change that came with Brexit revealed and then reinforced a concern about culture change within the UK that had been bubbling up for some time, and starting, or at least with a prominent role for concern about immigration and integration in the UK. But it suddenly gave it a badge and a label and an identity that it didn't really have in the party political system quite so clearly, and it made it real and easier for people to come in behind it. And I guess that's the dynamic that we've had, that it's definitely not a Brexit creation, but it's definitely a revelation, a revealing of that underlying concern about culture change among some groups, and then comfort that those types of culture changes among other groups that has divided the population into what are now still stronger identities among the public than party identities. But I think that is continuing to shift, and I guess the most interesting thing is the extent to which Brexit identities snap into alignment with party political identities as we go forward. I guess that's why we're most interested in the culture war aspect of it, as we're putting culture change more at the forefront of our media and political discussion, and the extent to which, whether the mechanism is increased issue polarization or increased effective polarization, just what side you identify with, or whether it's a party sorting mechanism, as Mo describes. I think that's where it gets riskier, is when those economic identities that you've got kind of in a left-right spectrum between Labour and Conservatives snap into alignment with the cultural axis on concern about culture change, that's where it gets worrying. I think where you get stuck into the types of things that Mo was describing about you can't compromise in the elites and in the activists, and then potentially in the population. So yeah, central to the dynamics in the UK, and I think only a partial project so far. And I don't. That is not going to. It's not that Brexit will continue to dominate our politics. It's what it morphs into and how aligned it becomes to party political identities is the key dynamic for us looking forward.
Now, Lily, I want to come to you because obviously it's interesting. A lot of what you and Mo said sort of overlaps, but you're just sort of looking through sort of different ends of the same telescope, I felt, in some respects. And there's really two things I want to ask you in relation to that. One, I think a key point which has come up a lot in the questions that we've been sent is about technology and social media. And I think a lot seems to hinge on whether sort of it was ever thus, and people once thought that the novel was ruining young minds in the 19th century, and people thought reading newspapers was ruining attention span. It's always been this way. But at the same time, every one of us who's actually engaged with social partisanship through social media feels that it is having this phenomenal atomizing effect of centrifugal machines, sending people to the most radical iteration of whatever view they had before. And those, so to begin with, sort of two thoughts. One, is that something qualitatively different that has happened? And the other point is one way to sort of reconcile the yours and Mo's positions, I suppose. I'm interested, if a large amount of this is being driven top down, how does that work alongside a breakdown in traditional cultural hierarchies, a culture of deference that meant that once people maybe did take their political views from sort of church elders or their parents or just politicians because they respected them, and now don't anymore? So pick either or both of those, and whichever one you don't do, I'll ask Mo to pick up.
Thank you for that. So, I mean, Mo touched on a little bit of the question about kind of social media and the kind of not great evidence for the idea that there are, internet bubbles, informational bubbles that people are really ensconcing themselves within. And in fact, Matt Lewandowski has a study talking about how if people who are exposed to news about America on Twitter have less hate for people in the other party, right? So if you just sort of prime their national identity, then it can reduce animosity between partisans, and people are exposed to that on Twitter as well, right? So. But at the same time, America has a history of yellow journalism and, all kinds of, false and inflammatory information being passed throughout society. It's correct that the internet makes it go faster. And I think that the main difference is just between, it's who is it affecting, who is it affecting, right? And so, we're finding this 10 to 20% of Americans who are approving of political violence, similar to to probably people who are extremely online or extremely into partisan media, where actually we do see a relationship between people who are exposed to partisan media and their attitudes about political violence. So, it's unclear what the direction is, right? Did the partisan media, push these people into extreme attitudes, or did extreme people just gravitate to partisan media as soon as it was available to them? And I don't think we know the answer to the direction of causality on that. But and then to the second question, so one thing that we are seeing is an increasingly anti-establishment approval of sort of anti-establishment views in the American electorate, so that people, and this is really pushing people towards Trump. One of the really appealing things about Trump is that he's very anti-establishment, and people who feel alienated or condescended to or looked down on were really very attracted to Trump and his campaign. And I've got some other research out that came out recently looking at kind of using the same data, the voter study group data that Mo was talking about. Basically, it's a great data set because it starts in 2011, and then they re-interview everybody in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and then I think they're still doing it. But so you can look at people who like Trump in 2018 and then kind of go back in time to 2011 before he was a major political figure and kind of figure out what characteristics of people tended to lead to them liking Trump in the future. And there really are, sort of, it was people who really didn't like African Americans, Hispanics, LGBT Americans, and Muslims. So it was really these sort of group-based attitudes, sort of animosity towards marginalized groups, that was a good indicator of Trump support in the future. And it did not predict support for the Republican Party, for Mitch McConnell, for Paul Ryan. It was really this unique effect to Donald Trump. So he's kind of coalescing this anti-establishment, anti-marginalized groups coalition within the Republican Party. And I think that's kind of creating even more stress on the system between the parties.
Thank you. Mo, can I ask you also that question about the sort of decline of established hierarchies? I mean, one of the things that I've certainly read in various sources, that this pertains to what's been called the sort of the post-truth problem in politics, that with there's no longer a sort of a commonly agreed basis of what's even a political fact that would allow people to have conversations and arguments across the political divide, because they're not even talking. There's a kind of an epistemological crisis, and that seems to be connected. Well, it might be accelerated by technology, but connected to a sort of a longer running decline in social institutions and authority. Why don't you take that? I've got other questions. Well, not my questions, but anyway, go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in communication, but yeah, my sense is that, I mean, when we were growing up, Walter Cronkite would do the news every night and he'd say, and that's the way it is, when he signed off. And people believed it. That's the way it was. Typically, he would be the most admired man in America when Gallup would do this poll. Now, can you imagine any anchor person today being the most admired person in America? That this sort of, the idea of anybody in the media being a credible source of authority and knowledge, that there are honest brokers out there, that I think has largely disappeared from the scene. And everybody thinks, I think with considerable justification, that everyone in the media has an axe to grind on one side or another. You're not getting, sort of, it's not just the slant of the stories, it's what they cover, where they place it, etc. And so I think it's one of the big losses that you can, if you want to, and the point I make is a whole lot of people don't want any information and sort of try to avoid it as much as they can, but you can sort of find a source that sort of supports your views. And it's very hard to end an argument by saying, here are the facts, and everybody agrees those facts, and then the argument's over. It just doesn't happen much anymore.
Can I just stay with you for a second, and then I'm going to bounce this back to Liliana before coming to Bobby to comment on the relevance to the UK context. It's a very interesting question. I'm going to read it out. Someone says, to reconcile the US speaker's views, is it possible that social conservatives fear that the advancement and preferment of racial and other minorities will be at their expense on the bread and butter economic issues? In the UK election, is translated as the Labour Party is only interested in minority causes, not in us. And I can add to that, certainly, when you ask people, what's the number one issue for them, they might say the health service, or they might say education, and then you drill in further. What they actually mean is, my kid's classroom is full of kids not speaking English, or my GP waiting room is full of foreigners, and actually race gets sort of camouflaged in these other issues. So maybe, Mo, you talked about the economy and the bread and butter issues actually still being dominant, but isn't it possible that really is just a way people are expressing actually a much more animated culture war partisan view, camouflaged?
There's this cottage industry in the US of people trying to statistically determine what was more important to Trump's vote, racial issues or economic issues. And if you have any sense of the history of social science, you say this is a crazy way to proceed. That coming out of World War II, there was this big literature on when does ethnocentrism and racism, et cetera, surge. It's when there's economic difficulty. That Hitler's party gets something like 2% of the vote in 1928, and they get up to 30-some% in 1932. What happened in between? The crash, et cetera. And so the idea, it's got to be considered more of a developmental sequence that these kinds of pathologies, social pathologies, surge when people were experiencing economic difficulties. And in particular, the kind of person who went for Trump were the kind of people left out in globalization. They're the kind of people in vast parts of the United States that were sort of factories closed, jobs moved south or overseas. And so I think if you had read any of Lipset or any of these people way back when, you just said, yeah, this is exactly what you'd expect given the social and economic developments of the U.S. And the other thing is the measures. Some of my very best friends are political psychologists, but this racial resentment measure that has such a profound relationship to everything, that's highly contested in the U.S. There are good scholars who think it is a measure of conservatism, liberalism, as well as a measure of racism. That it's hard to, if you're a real conservative, it's hard to agree with any of those items without looking racist. That if you're sort of favor of small government, individual responsibility, et cetera. So there are just, I can give you 20, 30 articles on contesting just what this measures, going back 20, 30 years, really, when David Sears and I think John Von Kinder came out with it.
Lily, can I ask you to pick some or any of that up and also tack on a question that's come in about age polarization, which Bobby mentioned, and which from the US presentations we've had seems to be less salient, but I imagine it's also a factor. So yeah, some or all of that, if you've got thoughts, which I'm sure you do.
Yeah, so how to start? So okay, so I mean, just on the racial resentment question, it is possible to, like, there's other measures that have been proposed, and when we've tried using those, and they work similarly at least in our political violence stuff, but the idea that race is like imbued into other sort of economic arguments or issues is pretty well supported. You know, this Michael Tesler has work on this what he calls the racial spillover effect that occurred really during and after the Obama presidency, where before Obama, attitudes about healthcare were not correlated with attitudes about race, but after Obama, they were. And the same with Alexander Filindra found gun control. Before Obama, gun control attitudes weren't correlated with racial attitudes, but after Obama, they were. So there was this sort of, and there's a lot, Barack Obama's presidency, not because of anything that he did, but just because he was a Black man in the White House, was, a clarifying indicator for a lot of people that weren't paying any attention to politics previously. It's a very easy cue to look at the president and say, that's a Democrat, right? That's what Democrats look like. And then am I one of them? So there is definitely an increasing racialization of our politics, and it does coincide with economic calamities, and but it also is like we have this history in the U.S. of economic or racial progress and then backlash. So we have Reconstruction after the Civil War, where these thriving Black communities are built, and then we have Jim Crow for 75 years, and then we have the civil rights legislation of the 60s, and then we have sort of the long Southern strategy of Nixon and Reagan, and now we have Barack Obama, and then we have Trump. So there is a history of sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in terms of making racial progress, and that's it is sort of imbued in a lot of American politics, I think. And I forgot your second part of the question.
Well, the behind the scenes, there is some polarization on the question as to whether we're supposed to finish at 6 o'clock or 6:15. But I'm going to abuse my position in the chair and say 6:15 because there are so many questions. But I'm going to go straight to Bobby because 2 things. There's one very specific question that has come in about whether there's data in the UK with regard to this. This question of that Lily mentioned, that the sort of difference between as it were, sort of emotional polarization, people feeling hot about their identity question, as distinct from the availability of whether or not there's actually a policy middle ground somewhere that you could compromise on. Do we have an equivalent observation that could be made about the UK politics?
Yeah, very
I hope
much.
that captured the question.
Yeah, yes, and yes, we have very similar measures, and it's the same. It's very similar sorts of pattern. I think we different in some senses, but in terms of the issue. In terms of issue polarization, we have a much more fragmented environment than a polarized environment. But on the effective emotional polarization, quite like the US, it is very polarized, as into 2 groups with dim views of the other side. So that is the issue. It's about those types of relationships. Can I just pick up on just those other 2 questions really quickly? I think on the age point, this gives me a chance to plug the book a little bit, because I do look at the generational difference in voting patterns in in the US. And there is a lot of focus in the US on this, about Darwin is coming for the Republican Party and all of that. But the age gaps are nothing like we've seen in the UK in the last few years. There is definitely an age gradient in voting and a cohort basis to that as well in some ways, but it's quite weak relative to the UK. So we're quite an outlier in that pattern that I showed on the gaps between the two main parties. And then just on your other point about that loss of way of life and that sense of threat among white communities. And I think one just sort of summary point from me on this, and it takes in other work that we're doing on inequality as well as culture wars, trying to look at that economic axis as well, is I think the thing that I kind of come to conclusion on from lots of conversation with people, that actually the sort of culture war element of this divide and looking towards the US as a potential model is maybe not that useful as a warning for our future, because you do need to have lots of conditions in place to end up in the sorts of position that you are in the US, all sorts of structural, historical, and media and political and all sorts of cultural aspects to it. But where we maybe have more threat of following an American path is more on that inequality side of things, where that sense of a loss of a way of life that Angus Deaton and Anne Case describe in the US in Deaths of Despair, and Bob Putnam talks about in The Upswing, and lots of US analysis and books focus on. I think we have got the start of that. We're probably further down that path in the sense of a loss of life chances, generation on generation life chances for particular parts of the UK community. And I think that's maybe a stronger warning to us than the culture war focus, that we need to be very mindful of the types of things you were talking about, Raphael, about that sense of being left behind, lack of connection and resentment. And a lot of the analysis on inequality misses the production side of this. It's all about the consumption side and redistribution of income and trying to make it fairer in that type of thing. But it's a lot to do with taking pride in production, that you're contributing to society in a meaningful way. And I think we haven't potentially listened closely enough to America on the lessons they've learned earlier than us on how important that sense of pride, contribution, respect for your community is to people on the production side, what you contribute.
Right, and although that it would be entirely different seminar, it's very interesting. You see, where's support from the Front National in France coming from? It's people who, a generation ago might even been voting for the Communist Party, certainly for the Parti Socialiste, and that leads me to actually something I wanted to ask both Mo and Lily in this context. This is me abusing my position in the chair for one last question about how relevant the end of the Cold War, the sort of long tail of the post-Cold War era really is in this. The fact that we lost organized Marxist politics, and I'm fascinated. Bobby, in fact, you said you were researching this question of woke, which is a term that no one really seems to be able to define. I've seen this concept of what's called the successor ideology, which is a term you have to use to describe a sort of a radical left impulse that doesn't really have anywhere to go because it's not attached to any organized doctrine anymore. It's just very angry about what the right is doing. And that seems to me to be one of the big structural factors in forming the culture war we have. The fact that the left side of it, for want of a better word, really doesn't have an organized doctrine. It's not nationalism. It's not the opposite of nationalism. I don't really know what it is. But without being able to call it something, it's very hard to describe, the political dynamics that it's involved in. So maybe, Maurice, I could ask you to go to that first, and then we'll finish with Lily.
Okay, I'll largely punt on it because this is kind of really big argument that doesn't lend itself well to detailed empirical work. But people like Fukuyama have made that argument that the end of the Cold War really opened the gates for the culture war in the US, because no longer having an external enemy, godless communism, to unite the country, then we're free to divide into all of these subnational identities. And he's not the only one, but I know that argument is out there. But how you would actually test it directly, I'm not sure. Maybe Lily can answer that.
Well, with perfect timing, Lily, you're going to have the last word on this, and it turns out the last word on the legacy of the entire 20th century for US and UK politics. So there's no pressure there. But if you could just summarize everything from 1989 onwards in about 27 seconds, that would be great. You can have a bit more than that if you need it.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, the absence of a common enemy can easily contribute to fracturing. Although what we're seeing in the context of the COVID pandemic is that the presence of a common enemy can also lead to fracturing, where if the two parties don't have trust for each other, don't trust each other, then responding to the threat itself creates more conflict between them because they don't believe that the other side is doing it right. And so that's what we've seen in the US with the pandemic, is that we have this global threat to all humans, and instead of coming together, the US splintered even further and continues to. Partly because the pandemic was politicized. So, these outside threats can kind of work both ways, depending on the underlying conditions. As for what the left is, I really feel like you can sort of get this sense of pulling forward and backward, right? The right is pulling backward to go back to the sort of traditional social hierarchy, traditional society. And the left is pulling away from that and trying to move out of that space into a more egalitarian space. And so with that kind of conflict, it's very difficult to find compromise. It's a tug of war. It's not everybody working on the same problem. It's people pulling on the same rope and trying to win. And that, I think, is part of the reason it's so intractable, and part of the reason that we're not seeing anyone even attempting to find compromise positions at this point, because compromise for both sides is undesirable. It would mean moving in a direction that they don't want to move. So that's just sort of the frame through which I'm seeing it today.
And it was very elegantly and efficiently communicated, because you brought us neatly to the end, more or less on time, close enough. We're not going to polarize too much around that particular point. I think we have demonstrated at least that in some corners of the internet, and there is available civil and open dialogue about these issues, although obviously the culture was happening elsewhere, not by us, but possibly to us. I'm also sure that were we actually in one room together with the audience, there would be a very hearty, lusty round of applause for those really fascinating contributions. So I want you to imagine virtually that sound as I thank you in turn, Bobby Duffy, Maurice Fiorina, Liliana Mason. I'm Raphael Baer. You don't need to thank me because I can do it for myself. But I believe we're out of time. So I'm going to stay here until someone tells me to get off Zoom. But everyone else, thank you very much. And thank you, Kings, for hosting this event.
Thank you.
Thank you.